Hey there. Imagine this. You open your eyes one morning and the world outside feels wrong. The air is thick, the light is dim, and even though the sun has risen, it barely cuts through a strange, lingering haze. The year is 536, and though you don't know it yet, historians will one day call this the worst year in human history. In the months ahead, summer never truly arrives. The skies stay a ghostly gray, crops wither in the fields, and the temperature drops in ways no one can explain. Famine follows, and with it, sickness and unrest. You hear whispers of kingdoms collapsing, of traders who vanish on the road, of strange red clouds in the sky. Even birds seem quieter, as if the whole world is holding its breath. But life goes on, and you must find a way to survive in a time when nature itself seems to have turned against humanity. Tonight, we're going to step into that world, moving slowly through its darkened streets and empty fields, piecing together the mystery of what happened and how people endured. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey to the year 536. You wake expecting the golden spill of sunlight through the cracks in your shutters. It's the way every morning has begun for as long as you can remember. The faint warmth pressing against your eyelids, the song of sparrows, already at work in the trees, and that quiet reassurance that the world is still turning as it always has. But today, there is no light. The air is heavy with a damp chill that clings to your skin before you've even swung your legs out of bed. You hesitate, eyes half open, waiting for the familiar brightness to flood in. Instead, the room is dim so dim, it might as well be the last breath of twilight. You rub your eyes, blink again, but the gloom doesn't lift. It's not sleep clouding your vision. The world itself has changed. When you push open the wooden shutters, the truth hits you harder than the cold air. The sky is not black, not stormy, but an ashen gray that seems to press down upon the earth. There is no horizon, no shape of clouds, no break where the sun should be. The light that does exist is pale and sickly, more like the glow of a dying candle than the brilliance of day. Your breath fogs in the chill, though it is supposed to be summer. The soil in the small patch of garden outside looks damp, but not from rain, more like the moisture of a cellar floor, stale and wrong. The trees stand motionless, their leaves a darker green than usual, as if the color has been sucked from them. Not a single bird sings. The silence is so complete, you can hear the creak of the shutters as they sway in your grasp. You step outside, wrapping your shawl tightly around your shoulders. The village is there, as it always is, stone cottages huddled together, thin curls of smoke rising from chimneys, but the air feels different. Dense, almost thick enough to taste. You breathe in, and it carries a faint, metallic tang, like the smell left after striking flint. It makes the back of your throat prickle. A neighbor emerges from her doorway, squinting at the sky with the same puzzled expression you imagine is etched across your own face. She doesn't greet you at first. Her eyes flick back and forth across the heavens, searching for the sun that refuses to appear. Finally, she mutters. It's as if the morning forgot itself. You try to laugh, but the sound dies before it leaves your lips. From somewhere down the narrow lane, a dog begins to bark a sharp, anxious sound. Then it stops abruptly. The quiet folds back in, heavier than before. It is only then you realize something strange about the light. Though you know it is morning, your own shadow is faint and blurred, as if the day is too weak to draw it clearly. You move your hand in front of you, expecting the silhouette to dance on the cobblestones, but it barely appears at all. An old man trudges past with a bundle of firewood on his back, his brow furrowed. The world's gone dim, he says without slowing. His voice has the uneasy weight of someone who has lived through many seasons, yet never one like this. The baker's shop is open, but no warm smell of bread drifts out. You glance through the doorway and see him standing motionless at his counter, staring at the dim window as though calculating whether it's even worth lighting the oven today. A few other villagers gather in the square, speaking in hushed tones. You catch fragments words like fog and smoke and bad omen. When you look up again, the gray sky seems to have lowered just a little. You tell yourself it's your imagination, but the thought clings to you like the damp in the air. The strangeness of the day seeps into your bones as you walk toward the edge of the fields. Normally, the sight here is a comfort wheat swaying under the morning sun, farmers already at work with their scythes. But today, the stalks stand still, their golden heads dulled to the color of old parchment. You run your fingers along one, and it feels brittle, too soon for harvest. The fields smell of earth and decay, as if autumn has arrived months too early. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Even that sound feels muted, muffled by the strange air, as though the very world has been padded in cloth. You stand there for a long while, trying to convince yourself this is nothing, that the sun will burn through the haze at any moment. But the minutes stretch into hours, and the light never changes. It remains that same lifeless gray, making it impossible to tell how much time has passed. By midday, the chill hasn't lifted. You find yourself shivering, and not only from the cold. There's a whisper of unease running through the village now, though no one dares say what they're truly thinking. The children play less loudly. The dogs keep close to their owners. Even the livestock seem restless, shifting in their pens and staring toward the horizon, as if they sense something coming. The strangest thing is how quickly your body begins to feel the lack of sunlight. It's subtle at first, a heaviness in your limbs, a faint ache in your chest, but as the day wears on, you realize you are more tired than you should be, more tired than the day itself has any right to make you. When evening comes, it's hard to tell. The gray dims only slightly before melting into a deeper, heavier darkness. The night sky holds no stars, only the faint outline of the moon, blurred as if seen through smoke. You lie in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that the world has been wrapped in a shroud. You think of the stories you've heard tales told by travelers in the tavern, about lands far away where the sky turned strange, and crops failed, where whole towns vanished in winters that never ended. You never believed them. Until now. And as you close your eyes, you wonder, will the sun ever return? Or is this the beginning of a season the world has never known before? You keep waking up each morning expecting, hoping that today will be the day the light comes back. But every sunrise is a trick now. The world is caught under a permanent veil, a gauze of thick ash and mist that seems to have swallowed the very soul of the sky. The sun is there, you think. It must be. But you can only see the faintest pale disk behind the shroud, like a coin pressed under frosted glass. No rays, no warmth, just a ghost. At first, people try to explain it away. It's a passing storm, they say, a season's quirk. Clouds will move on, and the sun will return. But after weeks, the excuses feel hollow. Children stop asking when the brightness will come back. Farmers stop planting, because even the hardiest crops won't grow without light. The earth stays cold, the soil damp and lifeless. And it has not just the sight of the sun that has gone. It has its power. Even at midday, shadows no longer form sharply. Instead, everything is bathed in a dim, sickly twilight. The warmth that once seeped into your skin on bright afternoons is gone. You pull your cloak tighter, even in summer, because the air never rises beyond a chilled breath. Animals grow restless. Chickens stop laying. Sheep huddle together in silent confusion. Birds change their migrations or vanish entirely. The morning chorus that used to greet the dawn now feels like a memory from another life. People begin to whisper. The sun is dying. God is angry. The world is ending. In the villages, priests call for prayer. In the cities, leaders summon healers, astronomers, and soothsayers, each offering a different explanation, none of them comforting. The elders say they've never seen anything like it. They've lived through harsh winters and poor harvests, but this is something else. The seasons themselves feel broken. Nights are longer now, or maybe they just feel that way, because the days never fully arrive. Lamps burn through more oil. Candles vanish from the markets as quickly as they can be made. The smell of tallow smoke clings to clothing and hair, because it is the only way to see in your own home. And with the absence of sunlight, sickness creeps in. Not the violent plagues of fever and cough, at least not yet, but a slow, draining weakness. People look paler, thin. Bones seem sharper under the skin. Spirits sag. Travelers arriving from distant lands bring the same reports. The dim sun, the biting cold, the endless haze. This is not a local curse, it's everywhere. From the shores of far kingdoms to the mountains beyond the trade routes, all are trapped under the same muted dome of sky. Still, you wait. Every morning, you open the shutters just a little too quickly, hoping against hope to see the return of a true sunrise. And every morning, your heart sinks again, because the sun, the real sun, is gone. And deep down, you're beginning to fear it may never return. The first signs were subtle, so subtle that in the beginning, most people didn't pay them much attention. A light frost forming on windowsills in the early morning, even though the calendar insisted it was midsummer. Breath clouding in the air when you stepped outside, the vapor hanging just a fraction longer than it should. At first, it was even considered beautiful by some a novelty, a strange twist to the season that made for good stories and photographs. But beauty soon gave way to unease when people realized the frost no longer melted in the morning, not even after the pale midday sun made its half-hearted climb into the sky. The days became sharper, their chill pressing closer, curling around your skin like an invisible hand. The air itself seemed denser, heavier, as though it had been stripped of all softness. Cold wasn't just something you felt anymore. It became a presence, a living thing, creeping through doorframes and the smallest cracks in the walls. At first, people thought thicker coats and heavier blankets would be enough, but this was not the kind of cold you could simply dress against. It found you in your sleep, seeping through the seams of your bedding, pressing into your bones. You would wake in the middle of the night, shivering violently, the ache in your joints lingering long after you had tried to warm yourself. Animals knew before people did that something was deeply wrong. Birds migrated far earlier than usual, their departure silent and hurried, leaving trees barren of life. Stray cats and dogs vanished from the streets, as though pulled away by some invisible tide. Even the insects, those tiny stubborn survivors, seemed to disappear. The world began to feel empty, and that emptiness had weight. People walked with their shoulders hunched and their hands buried deep in their pockets, their movements quick and purposeful, as though the air itself was an enemy to be avoided. Then came the biting winds. They didn't roar like winter storms. They whispered, sliding through alleyways and over rooftops with a patience that was far more unnerving. This was not the chaotic bluster of an ordinary cold front. It was calculated, deliberate. The wind seemed to understand exactly how to slip past your defenses, worming through the smallest spaces between buttons, sneaking under scarves, curling at the cuffs of your sleeves. Even inside, you could feel it, an invisible draft that no amount of insulation could entirely stop. Fires burned in hearths all day, not for comfort, but for survival. Yet even then, the warmth felt temporary, like a fragile shield that could collapse at any moment. Soon, the cold began to mark people. Lips cracked and bled. Skin turned pale, almost bluish, as circulation slowed. The elderly suffered the most. Aches in their bones worsened, and their frail bodies could not fight against the deep, marrow-deep chill. The cold was no longer just a condition of the environment. It became a sickness. People spoke of winter fatigue, of waking every morning feeling as though they had slept outside in the frost. Coffee no longer warmed you. It simply postponed the shivering for a short while. And still, the temperature kept falling. It was subtle but relentless, like a slow tide that refuses to recede. Day by day, a single degree here, a fraction of a degree. There it added up until one morning you stepped outside and felt the shock of air, so cold it stole your breath. The ground hardened underfoot, grass turning brittle and snapping like glass when stepped on. Puddles, which should have been liquid, froze overnight into sheets of ice, so thin they cracked like spiderwebs when touched. That was when communities began to change their habits. People stopped lingering outside. Streets that were once filled with children's laughter and neighborly chatter became quiet. Doors were shut and locked earlier in the day. Conversations grew shorter, voices muffled by scarves. Life became a cycle of darting from one source of warmth to another, the space between each sprint feeling longer and more dangerous as the cold grew bolder. The cold didn't just change the way people lived, it changed the way they thought. A subtle paranoia crept in, as though the frost outside the window was somehow watching, waiting. People began to hoard blankets, firewood, and candles. Old quilts were dug out from closets, stitched and restitched until they could be used again. Even those who had once laughed at the strange weather now spoke in hushed tones about how it just didn't feel right. Nights were the worst. Without the pale ghost of daylight to give some illusion of safety, the cold became oppressive. It had a sound, a faint ringing in your ears when you stepped outside after dark, a reminder that this air did not want you here. Windows frosted from the inside. The stars, when they appeared, seemed sharper, crueler, as if they were not simply distant, but frozen in place, watching over a world sinking into silence. By now, people had stopped pretending this was a passing weather anomaly. It was clear the cold was here to stay. What no one knew, what no one dared to ask aloud, was how much further it could go. Could it take more than warmth? Could it take the breath from your lungs, the life from the land? And if it could, would it? A year had always been measured by the cycles of growth. The first buds of spring, the sprouting green shoots, the slow swell of fruit on the vine, the fattening of grain heads in the wind. All of it was a language the land spoke to those who worked it. You could read the year in the color of the fields, in the scent of the air, in the calloused rhythm of hands pulling weeds and gathering what the earth had decided to give. But now, the language had gone silent. The fields were there, of course. You could walk them if you wished. You could run your fingers through the black soil and still feel its softness, still smell that deep, loamy scent that once meant life. But what rose from that soil now were not the green blades of wheat or the gold-tipped stalks of barley. What rose now was little more than twisted stems weak, brittle things that leaned sideways before they ever had a chance to grow straight. It began quietly, almost too quietly for anyone to notice. The seeds went into the ground as they always had. The planting days came and went, marked with that same tired optimism that had carried generations through storms, droughts, and blights. People had seen bad seasons before. They knew how to prepare. You always planted with the hope that at least some of it would survive. But this time, the warmth never came. Without the sun's strength, the soil stayed cold well into the months that should have brought heat. The seeds lay sluggish in the earth, taking far longer than usual to stir awake. And when they finally broke through the surface, they were pale things, ghostly versions of what they should have been. Their leaves curled inward, as if trying to protect themselves from a world that didn't want them. The farmers tried everything they knew. They plowed deeper, trying to aerate the soil. They covered the seedlings at night with whatever cloth or canvas they could spare, hoping to hold in the day's meager warmth. They even tried planting again, thinking perhaps the first sowing had simply been too early. It made no difference. The air itself seemed hostile. Even when there was no frost, the damp, Gray cold seeped into every leaf. The plants grew slowly, if at all, their roots struggling to draw what little nourishment they could from a ground that had stopped listening. In the villages, the talk at night turned from weather to worry. No one said the word famine yet, but you could see it in the way they looked at their food stores, in the way they measured flour with a little more care. The last year's harvest, which should have been enough to carry them comfortably until the next, was now being rationed without anyone admitting it. Bread loaves were baked smaller. Meat, when it was available, was stretched into stews that could last for days. People tried to convince themselves this was just a bad season. Every farmer has stories of years when nothing seemed to go right hail in midsummer, early frosts in autumn, pests that stripped the fields overnight. But this felt different. This wasn't nature being cruel in the usual way. This felt like the land itself was withdrawing, as if the earth had decided it no longer had the strength to feed its people. Some began to whisper that maybe it wasn't the land at all, that maybe something had happened far away, something in the sky. The dimness, the strange cold, it all had to come from somewhere. But what could you do about the sky? A man can plow a field, dig a trench, build a fence, but no man can reach up and drag the sun back where it belongs. By midsummer, the truth was impossible to ignore. The wheat fields that should have been waist-high were barely past the ankle. The barley had failed to form heads. Even the hardy root vegetables, the kind that could survive frost and flood alike, had grown stunted and tough, their skins thick and bare. The orchards bore almost nothing, just a scattering of small, sour fruit that clung to the branches as if ashamed to be seen. Livestock began to suffer next. With little grain to feed them and pastures too thin to graze, the animals grew lean. Milk yields dropped. Eggs became rare. And without healthy feed, even the strongest draft horses began to lose their strength, their ribs showing through their coats. Everywhere, the sound of hunger began to creep in, not yet the gnawing desperation of true famine, but the quiet unease of knowing that winter would come again, and there would be less to meet it with. In the towns, the markets shrank. Stalls that had once overflowed with produce now held only a few baskets, half empty before midday. The price of flour rose. Then it doubled. Then it doubled again. Those who could afford to buy did so in silence, under the watchful eyes of those who could not. The social rules began to shift in subtle ways. Neighbors who once shared freely now held back, waiting to see how long their own supplies would last. People locked their grain stores at night, something almost unheard of before. There were still those who believed the sun would return, that next season would be better. But belief doesn't fill a belly, and every failed harvest carved a little more of that hope away. The most unnerving thing wasn't the lack of food. It was the feeling that the earth was no longer part of the bargain. For all of human history, there had been an unspoken agreement. Plant in spring, tend in summer, harvest in autumn, endure in winter. Now, that pact was broken, and no one knew why. And so the days passed under that dim, stubborn sky, each one carrying the same unchanging view. Fields of withered stalks, swaying in a wind that felt colder than it should, as if it were blowing from some other place, entirely some far-off land where the sun had died long ago. The people waited, and the earth gave nothing. At first, the hunger is only an inconvenience. People grumble about smaller meals, about having to stretch what's left in their cellars. Families make jokes about the watery stews on the table, laugh about the odd combinations of whatever they can still find in their pantries. But the humor fades quickly. A week of smaller portions becomes 2, then 3. The body grows sluggish, the head heavy. Every step outside into the cold demands more energy than it can give back. The children are the first to show the change. Their cheeks lose color, and their play slows until they are sitting more than running, watching rather than joining. A mother calls her son to come inside, but the boy doesn't answer. She finds him leaning against the fence, eyes half shut, as if he might fall asleep where he stands. The doctor, one of the few still working in the village, says it's weakness from undernourishment. His advice, keep him warm, feed him what you can, is almost cruel. Everyone knows there's barely enough to feed anyone. The markets, once bright with stalls and shouting vendors, are quiet now. Those who still come set out a few sad offerings. A handful of turnips that look more like stones than vegetables, a stringy rabbit from someone's traps, a jar of cloudy honey guarded like gold. Coins are becoming useless. A woman offers a wool scarf for a sack of oats. Another offers a silver ring for 2 small loaves of bread. The trades are quick, and without ceremony people are too hungry to linger. At night you can hear it in the houses. The sound of pots scraped clean, spoons clinking against empty bowls, the low sighs of people lying down with nothing in their stomachs. The fireplaces give little comfort. Even if there is wood to burn, warmth can't replace the dull ache of hunger. Parents tell their children bedtime stories, not because they expect them to sleep easily, but because talking keeps their minds off the gnawing in their bellies. Soon, the poorer families begin disappearing from the streets. It's not that they've left theirs nowhere to go. They're simply too weak to come out. They lie in their beds, wrapped in every blanket they own, waiting for the next visit from a neighbor or a relative who might have a scrap of bread to share. The stronger ones go searching, not in the markets anymore, but in the edges of the forest, along frozen riverbanks, anywhere something edible might hide. They dig in the frost-hardened soil with bare hands, pulling up roots so bitter they burn the tongue. They strip bark from certain trees and boil it into a thin, strange-tasting broth that barely qualifies as food. Some find dried berries still clinging to thorny bushes, but the birds have taken most of them. Anything that can fill the stomach, even for a moment, becomes valuable. The hunger changes people. Neighbors who once exchanged smiles now avoid each other's eyes. They hide their meager stores, suddenly suspicious of everyone. A man who still has 2 sacks of grain moves them at night, fearing thieves. Even his friends are not told where they are kept. But desperation is a patient thing. It waits, creeping into minds slowly. At first, people still share a little when they can. A few potatoes split between families, a small piece of dried meat given to the old widow down the lane. But as the weeks drag on, the sharing stops. You cannot give away what you do not have. And then comes the theft. At first, it is subtle: an apple missing from a basket, a jar of pickled beets gone from a shelf. But soon, windows are found broken in the morning, doors forced open, storerooms ransacked. Dogs bark through the night, though they too are growing thin, their ribs showing through their fur. One night, a family wakes to find their smokehouse empty. Every strip of smoked fish they had saved for winter is gone. The father spends the next day asking questions, his voice tight with anger, but no one admits to anything. That evening, he sets a trap outside the smokehouse, a simple thing with a rope and a bell. 2 nights later, the bell rings. By the time he reaches it, the intruder is gone, leaving only footprints in the snow small ones, like a child's. The man says nothing about it after that. Some things, he decides, are better left unspoken. The village's poorest had it worst of all. With no land of their own to grow crops, no animals to slaughter, they rely entirely on what they can scavenge or trade for. When there is nothing left to trade, they simply go without. You can see them sitting outside their doorsteps when the weather allows, staring at the ground as though waiting for it to offer something. Rumors begin to spread about the next town over, stories of a man who was caught boiling leather from an old boot to make soup, of another who tried eating candle wax. People don't know whether to believe these stories, but they repeat them anyway. They become warnings, reminders of where hunger leads. One day, the baker closes his shop. His flour is gone, and no new sacks have arrived for months. He boards up the windows to keep people from breaking in, and a week later, he leaves entirely. No one sees him go, but they notice his absence. The smell of bread that once drifted through the streets is gone. Children cry more often now. Their hunger makes them irritable, their little bodies too weak to play. Mothers hush them, not because they're angry, but because they know crying burns energy they can't spare. Babies are quieter than they should be, their cries fading into soft whimpers. It's a sound more frightening than any loud wail. In the evenings, the sound of trading grows desperate. One man offers his winter boots for a single loaf. Another brings out his grandfather's pocket watch, a fine thing that once would have been worth much, and sets it on the table in front of a farmer with a half bag of barley. The farmer shakes his head. He has no need for a watch. He needs food as badly as anyone. Soon, there is talk of leaving heading south, where the cold might be less severe and the sun might shine again. But few have the strength for such a journey, and fewer still the supplies. Those who try often turn back within days, exhausted and half-starved, their faces hollow from the effort. The hunger becomes part of life. People move slower, speak less, think constantly about the next meal. Even sleep is no escape. The dreams are full of bread, roasted meat, ripe fruit, feasts that vanish the moment you reach for them. And still, the sun does not return. The frost clings to the fields, the rivers remain edged with ice, and the wind that blows through the village carries with it the sharp scent of emptiness. Hunger has taken root, and with every passing day, it grows deeper. For as long as anyone could remember, the sea was a constant in the lives of coastal villages, a source of food, of livelihood, and of rhythm. Fishermen woke before dawn, casting their nets into waters that teemed with fish, their lives shaped by tides and seasons, as sure as the rising and setting of the sun. The sea gave and the sea took, but it was a familiar force, reliable and timeless. But in the year 536, the sea itself seemed to rebel. It began with strange winds, sudden gusts that tore across the water without warning, sending waves crashing against the shore with a fury that had no place in summer. Fishermen who had spent decades reading the skies and tides found themselves baffled and powerless. The patterns they had learned since boyhood no longer held. The sea's moods were wild and unpredictable. One morning, a group of fishermen prepared their boats as usual, checking nets and bait, speaking quietly about the dim sky and the cold that never left. They knew the weather was changing, but they needed to fish. The storm came without warning, black clouds rolling in fast, wind howling like a beast unleashed. The sea rose and fell violently, smashing boats against the rocky coastline. Nets were torn apart, gear lost to the churning waves. The fishermen scrambled to safety, but not all made it. Some were swept away, swallowed by the cold, unforgiving water. The village woke to the sound of crashing wood and distant cries, knowing that the sea's fury had claimed more than just equipment. The storms didn't stop. For weeks, dark skies loomed over the coast, and every trip to the water became a gamble with death. The sea churned with a violent energy, sending waves that shattered boats, flooding docks, and eroding the earth beneath homes built close to the shore. With the fields failing inland, fishing became more vital than ever. But the sea, once generous, now seemed cruelly stingy. Fish were scarce. The cold waters held less life. Nets came back lighter, sometimes empty. Desperation grew with every failed catch. In the village, the mood darkened. Markets that once buzzed with fresh seafood now offered only the occasional shellfish scavenged from the rocks, or a meager salted fish that had been preserved for leaner times. The smell of the ocean, usually a bracing and familiar scent, turned sharp and bitter. Families who had depended on the sea for generations found themselves teetering on the edge. Without fish to sell or eat, the barter economy faltered. The price of saltfish skyrocketed. Some traded their last blankets or tools just for a few pieces of dried cod. The weather, too, turned erratic. One day was calm and eerily still, with a gray sky pressing low over the water. The next, a sudden gale would sweep through, uprooting trees and tearing roofs off houses. The villagers spoke in whispers of the angry sea, of a world turned upside down, where even the ocean did not follow its ancient laws. Fishermen began to venture farther out, risking longer voyages into unknown waters, chasing elusive shoals that might provide a catch. Many never returned. Their boats were found days later, smashed on distant shores or lost entirely. The storms brought more than just physical destruction. They also brought disease. Floodwaters spread sickness in their wake, contaminating wells and fields. The sick, already weakened by hunger and cold, struggled to recover. The village healer, once confident and strong, found himself overwhelmed, his remedies failing against the new onslaught. As the seas grew angrier, so too did the people. Tensions flared over dwindling resources. Fishermen blamed farmers for hoarding grain. Farmers accused fishermen of wasting what little food they caught. Neighbors turned wary. Doors were bolted tight at night, and a once close-knit village felt its fragile bonds fraying. Children were warned to stay away from the shore, where the waves could snatch them in a heartbeat. But some, too weak and hungry to stay inside, were drawn to the water's edge, watching the restless sea with hollow eyes. Amidst this turmoil, stories began to spread tales of monstrous waves that rose like walls, of waters turning blood red, of strange creatures seen in the depths. Some said the gods were angry. Others whispered of dark magic. Through it all, the sea kept roaring, relentless and wild, a living symbol of a world unraveling. In times of crisis, stories become lifelines, threads of meaning woven through uncertainty, the fragile way people make sense of a world unraveling before their eyes. In the villages cut off from the light and warmth they once knew, those stories began to come not from the sky or the land, but from the travelers and traders who still braved the roads. Their arrival was sporadic and rare. Most people had long since given up journeys that offered no certainty of food or shelter. Yet the merchants who pushed through frostbitten fields and muddy passes carried news like flickering candles in the darkness. They spoke in hushed tones of great fires that had consumed lands far beyond the horizon. Tales of mountains that roared and exploded, spitting ash like black snow into the sky. Of skies choked with smoke so thick it blotted out the sun for months on end, turning days into endless twilight. The stories sounded like myth, impossible, like the whispered legends of old gods punishing mankind. But the weight in the traveler's eyes gave the words a gravity no one could ignore. One merchant described crossing a river where the water ran warm and thick with ash, the banks barren and blackened. He spoke of villages wiped from the map, fields buried under layers of soot and debris, and skies painted an unnatural gray. Another told of a city where the sun was a faint ghost behind the smoke, its people struggling to breathe and find food in the choking gloom. The rumors spread quickly. Some villagers dismissed them as exaggerations, the tales of desperate men seeking to sell their wares through fear. Others clung to the stories, hoping to understand why their world had changed so utterly. At night, gatherings around flickering fires became forums for shared fears and desperate hopes. Elders compared the reports with memories of previous hardships, volcanic eruptions, plagues, famines, searching for familiar patterns in the chaos. The most harrowing tales were of ash that fell like snow, covering roofs, fields, and roads, of skies that never cleared, of rivers turned dark and silent. The idea that some distant disaster could ripple across the world to reach even these isolated places was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. If the calamity had a source, then maybe it could end. Maybe the sun would return when the ash settled. But the longer the travelers stayed, the more hopeless the news became. Ash storms were not ending. The fires that blazed in the mountains continued to burn, fueled by winds that carried soot halfway across the world. Crops had been destroyed not only here, but in far-off lands. Starvation was not a local misfortune, but a global one. In the villages, people began to ask questions they had never dared to consider before. Was this punishment from the gods? Had mankind angered the heavens? Was this the end of the world as they knew it? Religious leaders preached sermons of repentance, urging faith and prayer. Some villagers turned to old rites and rituals, hoping to appease forces beyond their understanding. Others simply fell silent, overwhelmed by the weight of despair. The traders themselves seemed changed by their journeys. Faces once full of life grew drawn and pale. Voices dropped to whispers when speaking of the ash-covered lands. Even the hardy ones, accustomed to hardship and travel, carried a haunted look as they moved through the villages. Letters and manuscripts began to circulate, accounts from distant cities, sketches of ash-choked skies, maps marking the areas blotted out by fire and smoke. Scholars and scribes debated the cause, speculating on volcanic eruptions, celestial phenomena, or even curses. But for the common folk, the explanations mattered less than the reality they lived. A sunless sky, a biting cold, and a world that seemed to be dying before their eyes. And as the ash continued to fall far away, and the sun refused to shine here, the whispers became a constant hum, a reminder that this darkness had a beginning, but no known end. In the relentless shadow of a dimmed sun and an unyielding cold, hunger became a cruel companion. The body, starved of proper nourishment, weakened day by day. Muscles wasted away, the skin grew thin and pale, and strength, the most basic defense against illness, began to slip through the fingers like sand. Where once the village had buzzed with cautious hope, it now stood fragile and silent. Children, once lively and curious, grew listless. Adults who had withstood the bitter cold and meager rations found their bodies surrendering to exhaustion. It was in this fragile state that the plague found its opening. The sickness began quietly, as it often does. A fever here, a rash there, sores that would not heal. At first, people thought it was just weakness, the natural consequence of hunger and cold. But soon, it became clear this was something different, something far more dangerous. The healer, overwhelmed and under-resourced, worked tirelessly to soothe the symptoms. Poultices of herbs were pressed against swollen joints. Bitter teas were brewed to break the fever. Prayers were whispered into the quiet rooms of the sick. But the plague moved faster than any remedy. It spread like a shadow, slipping unseen from house to house. Families who had cared for one another now found themselves isolated. The fear was palpable. To touch the sick was to invite death. Those stricken were often left alone, their moans echoing through empty streets. The plague did not discriminate. The old and the young, the strong and the weak, all fell victim. The hunger had made bodies vulnerable, but the disease itself was merciless. Villagers watched in horror as neighbors withered away in days, their bodies covered in painful sores that burned and festered. Fever stole their minds, dragging them into delirium. Many died alone, their last breaths whispered into the cold night air. The disease brought with it more than death. It brought despair. Families tore apart by grief, households abandoned as survivors fled to escape the invisible threat. The communal bonds that had once been the village's strength began to unravel. In the markets, fear replaced hunger as the dominant force. People avoided crowded places, trading less and less. The healer's hut became a place of dread, a gathering point for the sick and the dying. Yet, despite the terror, no one could turn away those who needed help. Efforts to contain the plague were hampered by the very conditions that allowed it to flourish. Overcrowded homes, poor sanitation, and the inability to isolate the ill created a perfect storm for the disease's spread. The ash in the air clogged lungs and made breathing difficult, weakening defenses further. The dead were too many to bury properly. Graves grew crowded, shallow pits hastily filled to keep the bodies from piling in the streets. The smell of decay hung heavy over the village, a sickening reminder of the lives lost. Stories spread of the plague's cruelty, of victims who, even as their bodies failed, were haunted by visions of the sunless sky, by voices calling them into the darkness. Some said the disease was a punishment for humanity's sins, a curse brought by the ash that choked the heavens. The healer kept records, marking the names and dates as best as he could. The list grew longer by the day. Mothers lost children, husbands lost wives, friends lost friends. Each loss carved a deeper wound into the community's heart. Amidst the grief, some tried to resist despair. Small acts of kindness, shared blankets, a warm word at the bedside of the dying, these became acts of rebellion against the shadow that engulfed them. Yet, with every life claimed by the plague, the village grew smaller, quieter, more fragile. The sunless sky hung heavy above, a silent witness to the suffering below. And still, the sickness found the weak. As the sun's light faded and the cold crept deeper into the bones of the land, the devastation was no longer confined to the villages and fields. The ripples of disaster spread far beyond, reaching the halls of kings and the seats of power where decisions shaped the fate of entire peoples. Once mighty kingdoms, built on foundations of stability, wealth, and tradition, found themselves trembling on the edge of collapse. The crops that fed armies failed. The trade routes that sustained cities became impassable or barren. The very fabric of order began to fray as hunger and fear spread from the common folk to the highest towers. Rulers who had once ruled with confidence faced an enemy they could neither see nor fight. The dimmed sky was a constant reminder that their world was changing in ways no sword or decree could fix. They found their advisors divided, some urging strict control, others desperate for mercy. But no counsel could stop the growing unrest. In many places, the tax coffers emptied as peasants could no longer pay their dues. Soldiers went unpaid and disbanded, wandering the land hungry and bitter. Without their loyalty secured by wages and food, armies turned inward, becoming threats to their own lords. Rebellion, once rare and swiftly crushed, began to bloom like weeds in neglected fields. Small bands of desperate men and women, armed with whatever they could find, took advantage of weakened defenses. They raided grain stores, seized castles, and declared new rulers where old ones had lost their grip. Courts that had once echoed with music and laughter grew quiet, filled instead with the whispers of conspiracy and fear. Nobles eyed one another with suspicion, unsure who might betray their fortunes to save themselves. Alliances forged in peace turned brittle under the strain of scarcity and paranoia. In some kingdoms, leaders fled their seats, abandoning their people to wander aimlessly or fight over scraps. Others tightened their grip, imposing harsh laws and brutal punishments in a futile attempt to maintain order. The cruelty only deepened resentment, and revolts multiplied. Great cities, once bustling centers of commerce and culture, were not spared. Markets closed, streets emptied, and walls once impregnable grew vulnerable to siege and looting. The grand palaces that symbolized power now stood as hollow monuments to a vanished age. The disruption of harvests, the ravages of disease, and the fury of the elements had combined into a perfect storm that no throne could withstand. It was not a battle fought with armies, but a slow unraveling of trust, security, and survival. Stories spread of kings who died in exile, of queens who starved in their chambers, of generals who turned their swords on their own men. The great houses fractured, and the maps of the known world began to shift. Borders blurred as lawlessness grew. Amidst the chaos, some leaders sought new ways. They reached out to former enemies, proposing alliances born of necessity rather than friendship. Others turned inward, hoping isolation could shield their realms from the spreading darkness. But isolation was an illusion. The disruption was global, crossing mountains, seas, and deserts with an unstoppable momentum. No kingdom, no matter how grand or distant, could claim immunity. Even the church and its leaders, pillars of stability for centuries, found their influence challenged. Faith was tested as famine and plague brought doubt and despair. Pilgrimages ceased, congregations dwindled, and holy places fell into neglect or ruin. In the end, the fall of kingdoms was a mirror of the fall of the people. As the earth grew cold and dark, so too did the hearts of those who ruled. The grand structures of power crumbled beneath the weight of hunger, fear, and loss. And as one kingdom after another fell, the world grew quieter, not just in the fields or streets, but in the very soul of humanity. In a world darkened by the dimmed sun and chilled by relentless cold, the boundaries between hope and despair began to blur. When the familiar rhythms of life broke down, people sought meaning in the only places left to them: their faith, their fears, and the stories passed from one trembling voice to another. At the heart of every village, town, and city, the church remained a bastion, a place where flickering candles cast shadows on worn stone walls, where prayers rose like smoke into the uncertain heavens. For many, faith was the fragile thread that kept them tethered to a world slipping away. On mornings when the sky refused to brighten, when the frost bit deep and the fields lay barren, the faithful gathered. Their voices, thin but determined, lifted in prayer. They begged for mercy, for the sun's return, for protection from the sickness that preyed on their weakened bodies. The hymns carried a desperate urgency, a hope that somehow, through faith, the darkness might be lifted. Yet alongside that hope grew a gnawing fear that the end had indeed come. Some believed the suffering was divine punishment for sins unknown. The clergy spoke of repentance, calling for penance and humility, urging their congregations to seek forgiveness before the final reckoning. In worn pulpits, priests and monks preached of judgment days and the need to purify hearts and souls. The rituals became more frequent, more fervent. Processions wound through the streets, carrying crosses and relics, voices chanting pleas for salvation. People clung to these moments of communal faith, finding strength in numbers and the shared longing for light. But faith was a double-edged sword. As hope for relief flickered, suspicion and paranoia took root. The endless darkness and unyielding cold demanded an explanation beyond natural causes. And in that void, fear found a scapegoat. Whispers spread of neighbors who consorted with dark forces, who brought misfortune through curses or secret rituals. Accusations of witchcraft began to rise, fueled by old superstitions and the human need to blame. Women, often those on the margins, the widowed, the healer, the outspoken, became targets. Their knowledge of herbs and healing, once respected, was now twisted into suspicion. Their quiet prayers and solitary walks through the woods were seen as signs of malice. In some villages, trials were held informal and brutal. Accused witches were subjected to tests both cruel and absurd, walking blindfolded over burning coals, submerging hands in freezing water, or answering impossible riddles. Failure meant punishment, exile, or worse, the fear fractured communities. Friends stopped speaking, families turned against one another, and the fabric of trust unraveled. Neighbors watched each other with narrowed eyes, guarding doors and windows, ready to accuse at the slightest misstep. Amid the turmoil, some clergy exploited the chaos. They preached fire and brimstone, calling for purges and cleansing of sin through any means necessary. The line between spiritual guidance and fanaticism blurred as power shifted into the hands of those who wielded fear. But there were others, quiet voices of reason and compassion, who sought to calm the hysteria. They reminded their congregations that true faith was mercy, not judgment. They cared for the sick without fear, stood against cruelty, and tried to preserve the fragile threads of community. Still, the struggle between faith and fear played out in every corner of the shadowed world. It shaped decisions, broke relationships, and defined lives. Children learned to hide their questions, to watch their words, to tread carefully in a world where belief could be both salvation and condemnation. And all the while, the sun remained hidden, the cold held firm, and the darkness deepened, not just in the skies, but in the hearts of those who endured. When the earth offers no shelter, and the sky denies its light, people begin to wander. The familiar soil beneath their feet becomes a grave of broken promises. No food, no warmth, no future. Villages that once thrived, filled with laughter and the rhythm of daily life, began to empty as families packed what little they could carry and stepped into the unknown. It was a slow, painful process, a quiet unraveling of homes and hearts. Some left out of hope, believing that beyond the cold and darkness lay a place where the sun still shone, where fields were green and food was plenty. Others fled from fear of starvation, of disease, of the growing cruelty that shadowed the empty streets. The journeys were harsh and unforgiving. People traveled in groups when they could, but many set out alone or in small families, their footsteps a faint trace against the frozen earth. The roads, once busy with merchants and travelers, now echoed with silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath weary boots and the soft cries of children too weak to walk. With every mile, the cold deepened. Nights were spent under thin blankets or in the meager shelter of caves and abandoned huts. Fires were lit cautiously, their smoke a beacon for both hope and danger. Hunger gnawed at bellies, and thirst parched mouths. Families shared what little they had, a crust of bread, a scrap of dried meat, a handful of wild berries found along the way. But even these meager comforts became scarce as the journey stretched on. The weak fell behind, their steps slowing until they could go no further. Some sank into the snow, their breath shallow, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Loved ones carried them when they could, but the burden was heavy, and there were only so many who could be helped. Tragedy was constant. A child's cough turned to fever and death. An elder's legs gave out on a frozen hill. The line between life and death blurred with every frozen dawn. Beyond the cold and starvation, the migrants faced human threats. Bandits roamed the roads, desperate and violent. They preyed on the vulnerable, stealing food, valuables, even children. Travelers learned to keep their fires small and their groups tight, but danger lurked in every shadow. Some villages and towns barred their gates, unwilling or unable to offer refuge. Signs warned of sickness and starvation, and fear kept doors closed. The migrants became ghosts, wandering from place to place, rejected by a world already stretched thin. Stories spread of whole families vanishing without a trace, swallowed by the winter or by the cruelty of men. Mothers wept for children lost in the wilderness. Husbands mourned wives taken by illness or violence. Yet, despite the suffering, the will to survive burned fiercely. Each step forward was an act of defiance against the darkness. Each shared meal, each whispered prayer, a testament to hope. Along the roads, makeshift camps formed, fleeting communities bound by shared desperation. People exchanged news, traded scraps, and cared for the sick as best they could. In these moments, humanity flickered amid the shadowed landscape. But the road was long, and the end uncertain. Many would never find the warmth or food they sought. Many would become part of the silence that grew over the frozen earth. And so the migrations continued, a haunting procession of the lost and the hopeful walking toward a future no one could see clearly, only feel in the cold that bit deep into their bones and the darkness that stretched endlessly above. Amid the crushing weight of hunger, cold, and despair, there were moments, brief and precious, when humanity's light shone through the darkness. In the year 536, a time marked by relentless hardship and loss, these rare acts of kindness became lifelines, small sparks that kindled hope in hearts otherwise consumed by fear. In the empty streets and frostbitten fields, where survival demanded every ounce of strength, some souls found the courage to give what little they had to those who had even less. Sharing bread, shelter, a kind word, these gestures were not acts of charity, but of profound solidarity. One such story comes from a small village near the coast, where a widow named Eleanor lived in a crumbling cottage. She had lost her husband to the cold, her children to the plague, and yet, when a group of weary travelers appeared at her door, gaunt faces, torn clothes, eyes hollow with hunger, she opened her arms. Eleanor had only a loaf of hard, stale bread left, barely enough for herself. But she broke it into pieces and shared it among the visitors. She offered what warmth she could muster from the dying embers of her hearth and a corner of her bed. Word of her kindness spread, inspiring others to find whatever scraps they could spare. A farmer shared a handful of grain. A merchant, a sealed jar of preserved fruit. A child, a small bundle of wildflowers picked from the frost. In towns where distrust had taken root, secret networks began to form. People whispered about safe houses, hidden cellars stocked with food, and messages passed along roads like precious cargo. These acts were risky sharing, meant risking one's own survival, but the bonds of compassion proved stronger than the fear. Travelers who had endured weeks on the road carried news of places less ravaged by cold or hunger. They spoke of distant villages where the sun had returned, where crops grew thin but steady. Those who heard these stories dared to dream again, planning journeys with cautious hope. In another village, an old blacksmith used his dwindling supplies to mend broken tools for farmers too weak to work their fields. His forge, once blazing with fire, was now a flicker, but the repaired plows and sickles gave a chance at renewal. At the edges of towns, children shared what little they had with their playmates: a crumb of bread, a piece of cloth fashioned into a doll, a song hummed softly in the cold night. These small gestures reminded everyone that life, however fragile, still pulsed beneath the surface. Even enemies found moments of mercy. Bandits who had long roamed the roads began leaving food at crossroads, silently acknowledging a shared humanity in suffering. In rare instances, rival groups laid down arms to help carry the sick or build shelters against the biting wind. Religious leaders, too, played a role in nurturing kindness. Some monks and priests risked their own safety to tend to the ill, to distribute what supplies they could, and to offer words of comfort. Their chapels became havens amid the desolation, places where the weary could find rest and the hopeful could gather strength. But kindness was not always met with gratitude. Those desperate and broken sometimes rejected help, wary of hidden motives or ashamed of their weakness. The burden of survival could twist hearts, making generosity a painful risk. Still, in the darkest moments, these rare acts created ripples. They reminded people that even when the world seemed to crumble, there was still something worth fighting for: connection, compassion, the simple act of giving. Stories of kindness were shared around fires, passed from lips to ears in the long nights. They became legends, whispered reminders that humanity could endure even the worst of times. And so, despite the endless cold, the unyielding darkness, and the relentless hunger, these sparks of grace persisted. They wove a fragile tapestry of hope, a quiet resistance against the despair that threatened to consume all. In the year 536, when the worst seemed certain, kindness proved that even in the deepest shadows, light could still be found. After months' snow, more than a year of unbroken gloom, endless frost, and merciless hunger, something shifted. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible against the backdrop of despair, but it was there, a thin, fragile promise of change. The haze that had choked the sky like a thick, suffocating blanket began to lift, ever so slightly. Not enough to banish the darkness or warm the air fully, but enough to let a pale light seep through a whisper of the sun's old glow, a hesitant greeting from a sky long dormant. People noticed. They felt it first in the way the cold bit a little less sharply at their fingers and cheeks. They noticed it in the way the air smelled different, not quite so heavy with ash and decay, but tinged with a fresh, almost sweet scent carried by the breeze. Farmers, long resigned to barren fields, dared to scratch the frozen earth with tools they had kept sharpened in hope more than expectation. To their surprise, they uncovered small green shoots, stubborn and bright against the gray soil. Gardens that had lain fallow, overtaken by frost and weeds, showed signs of life. Delicate leaves unfurled, reaching toward the pale light, as if celebrating their own survival. A few wildflowers bloomed where none should have dared, their colors muted but undeniable. These signs were small, almost insignificant in the face of the overwhelming devastation, but to those who saw them, they were miracles. Mothers showed sprigs of green to their children, pointing to them as proof that the world was not finished, that life still held its place. In the villages, the mood began to shift. Where once the silence had been heavy and crushing, a cautious optimism stirred. Conversations became less about survival alone and more about rebuilding. Plans were whispered for planting crops, for repairing homes battered by storms and neglect. Travelers who had endured months on the road spoke of other regions where the sky too seemed to brighten, where streams ran clearer and fish returned to rivers. These reports, carried on tired feet and hopeful hearts, wove a thread of connection between distant communities, an invisible lifeline across a battered world. The healer, who had faced the plague's darkest days, found renewed purpose. Herbs grew again in small gardens, and with fresh plants came new remedies. Wounds that had festered began to heal. Fevers broke more quickly. Bodies, though still weak, showed signs of regaining strength. The blacksmith's forge, long cold, flared to life once more. Sparks flew as hammer met anvil, shaping tools to till the recovering earth and mend broken homes. The sound, once foreign in the silence, was a song of renewal. Religious leaders preached not only of repentance, but of gratitude, urging their flocks to recognize the gifts of survival and rebirth. Services were held in renewed churches and chapels, where candles burned brighter and hymns rose with fresh energy. Yet, despite this fragile hope, the scars of the past year remained. Fields were still scarred and uneven. Wells ran shallow. Many homes stood empty, their inhabitants lost to sickness or the roads. Grief lingered in the eyes of those who had survived. Communities faced the daunting task of rebuilding not only their physical world, but the bonds fractured by fear, starvation, and loss. Trust had to be carefully mended, and old wounds tended with care. Children born during the dark months grew pale and thin, their fragile lives a reminder of the costs borne by all. Education, once taken for granted, was a distant dream as families struggled to find food and shelter. But through the slow work of days and months, the first shoots of recovery took hold. Fields were planted, wells cleaned, and homes repaired. Life's pulse, faint but steady, returned to the earth. The sun, though still pale and distant, shone longer each day. It cast a gentle warmth that coaxed blossoms from buds and hope from despair. And in the hearts of those who had endured the worst year ever, a quiet vow took root. To remember the darkness, yes, but to hold fast to the light that followed. The year 536 did not end with a triumphant sunrise or a joyful celebration. Instead, it left a world forever changed, a scar etched deeply into the bodies and souls of those who survived. For many, survival was not a victory, but a burden, a heavy price paid in thin bodies, hollow eyes, and an aching heart filled with loss. Those who lived through the cold, the darkness, and the despair carried marks that no medicine could heal. Their skin was stretched tight over bones weakened by hunger. Faces once full of life now bore the gauntness of famine and sleepless nights. The brightness in their eyes had dimmed, replaced by shadows of grief and endurance. Communities gathered to rebuild, to plant new seeds, and repair shattered homes. But beneath the surface, the wounds ran deep. The memory of 536 was not just a chapter in history. It was a living, breathing presence, a wound that pulsed with every breath. Mothers mourned children who had vanished into the darkness of plague and starvation. Fathers bore the silent weight of promises they could not keep, unable to protect their families from the cold grip of death. Brothers and sisters remembered faces that would never return, names spoken softly in the quiet moments before sleep. Many survivors found themselves haunted by the ghosts of those they could not save. Dreams were filled with images of hollow-eyed neighbors, the sounds of distant cries, and the bitter taste of loss. These memories followed them like shadows, unshakable and relentless. The physical toll of survival was matched by emotional scars. Trust, once freely given among neighbors and friends, had to be rebuilt slowly. Fear and suspicion lingered, remnants of the harsh choices made when resources were scarce and desperation ruled. Families fractured under the strain. Some found solace in each other. Others drifted apart, unable to reconcile the pain of what they had endured. Communities struggled to support those who carried the heaviest burdens, the widowed, the orphaned, the broken. Yet amid the suffering, stories of resilience emerged. Survivors shared tales, not only of loss, but of courage and hope. They spoke of kindnesses that saved lives, of small victories in the face of overwhelming odds. These stories became a foundation for healing, a way to honor the past while looking toward the future. The scars of 536 shaped generations to come. Children born after the dark year grew up with stories whispered at their bedsides, warnings of what hunger and despair could bring, lessons on the strength required to endure. Even as the world slowly recovered, the shadow of 536 remained a reminder of the fragility of life and the cost of survival. The year had taken much, but it had also taught much. It revealed the depths of human suffering and the heights of human endurance. It showed how darkness could consume, but also how light, no matter how faint, could persist. For those who lived, the price was lifelong. But in their endurance, they carried a quiet hope, a belief that even after the worst, life could find a way to continue. The year 536 was more than a moment in time. It became a shadow, long, dark, stretching far beyond its own days into generations yet to come. Even decades later, people spoke in hushed tones about the year when the sun failed, the sky darkened, and the earth seemed to falter beneath their feet. The stories passed from parent to child, whispered by elders by the firelight, etched into the collective memory like an old scar. It was a year that changed everything: how people lived, how they thought, how they hoped, and how they feared. Farmers who had once taken the seasons for granted now watched the skies with wary eyes. They learned to plant earlier, to prepare for the unexpected frost, to store seeds carefully, and spread risk across fields. The lessons of 536 became guiding rules, a hard-earned wisdom forged in frost and fire. In villages and towns, rituals were born from the darkness. People developed new prayers and ceremonies to honor the sun, to plead for warmth, and to protect their crops. Festivals that once celebrated the changing seasons took on new meaning, tinged with reverence and caution. Children grew up learning not just stories of heroes and kings, but of the year when the sun vanished. The skies were choked with ash, and the world seemed on the brink of ending. These stories shaped their view of the world, a reminder of fragility, but also of resilience. Even in art and song, the shadow of that year lingered. Painters captured the pale, ghostly skies and barren fields. Poets wrote of hunger and hope intertwined. Musicians composed melodies that echoed the quiet sorrow and quiet strength of those times. Governments and rulers, haunted by the chaos that had toppled kingdoms, grew cautious. They invested in granaries, in infrastructure to withstand disaster, and alliances that could provide aid across borders. The memory of collapse was a lesson written in blood and ash. Religious beliefs adapted too. New sects arose, preaching both fear of divine wrath and promises of redemption. The dark year was seen as both punishment and test, a challenge to faith that forced believers to reconsider their place in the world. Psychologically, the impact was profound. People lived with a heightened awareness of mortality and the precariousness of life. Anxiety about the sky and the seasons became a part of daily life. Fear of another dark year, another disaster, influenced decisions large and small. Yet, in the shadow of fear, hope endured. Communities banded together, sharing resources and knowledge. They cultivated gardens, repaired homes, and built traditions that celebrated survival as much as life itself. The long shadow of 536 was not only a reminder of loss, but also a testament to endurance. It shaped a generation's identity, a generation that learned that even when the worst happens, the human spirit can persist, adapt, and rebuild. And as the years turned to decades, the memory of that darkest year remained alive, a silent witness in the hearts of all who lived through it and all who came after. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the darkest year in history, 536, when the sun vanished, the cold took hold, and the world faced unimaginable hardship. We've seen how people struggled, survived, and ultimately began to heal, carrying scars that shaped generations to come. It is a story of despair, but also of hope, a reminder that even in the bleakest times, humanity's resilience shines through. If you found this exploration fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most mysterious and impactful moments. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss an upload. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this story moved you most? Drop a comment below and let's chat. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and let's keep uncovering the stories that shaped our world. Take care,